Okay, thank you, Dr. Ghali, for inviting me to Kai Winter School as a graduate this time and not as a student. So I'm going to talk about my thesis work. As you can see from the title, it's Bioethical Deliberation on Genomic Testing from the Islamic Perspective.
Just introduce yourself to the floor first.
Yeah, my name is Ali Al-Shakaki. I graduated last year from CILE program on May 2019. And this is my thesis. I'm going to talk about it. So I just want to give some brief summary of the definition of genome and its characteristic, because I believe that it's important for any bioethicist dealing with the issue of genomics to be acquainted with its basic information. So genetic information is passed from one parent to the offspring, meaning that from one generation to the next. So this is why the family members tend to have similar characteristics. So the secret of life, it's our genes that shape our genotype and phenotype. So what the meaning of genotype? It's our genetic makeup. We don't see it, it's concealed. And the phenotype is the expression of the genotype in our physical appearance. So this is why we look different. African population is different from Middle Eastern population, different from Caucasian, different from Asian and Indian, and so on. So if you do genomic testing, what will happen? In a simple term, we'll know a tsunami of information, a huge amount of information, everything about yourself, everything that you want to know about yourself, and everything that you don't want to know about yourself. It also has the power of predictability. We can predict certain disease, like Alzheimer's and Huntington, that you will end up having in your life when you reach certain age. And also, it's relevant for family and heritage because we know about what we know about you might be highly relevant to your family as well. As I mentioned, that we share the same DNA with our parents, with our siblings, and with our kids as well. So it's interdisciplinary topic for medicine. It opens the door for a new era of medicine. It's called precision medicine. So what the meaning of this one? It's meaning that healthcare tailored to each individual. And also it's important for biomedical research because it offers a lot of opportunities to understand the human biology. But ethics here is very sensitive. It's highly relevant and challenging. So how can we handle and regulate all obtained information by genomic testing? So this is my thesis outline. So my thesis is a comprehensive study consulting diverse fields and sources. I consider the scientific and medical aspect of genomic testing. I put it in my chapter 1. I also consider the Western bioethical literature, where I put it in chapter 2, and in chapter 3 is mostly Islamic normative ethical perspective. So my targeted audience are various stakeholders, including religious scholars, healthcare professionals, and healthcare policymakers. So this is my thesis outline, introduction, where I outline my main questions, sub-questions, literature review, and methodology. In my chapter 1 is more or less about medical aspect of genomic testing, as I explained. Chapter 2 is more or less about ethical perspective, and chapter 3 is about Islamic. The core part of my thesis, chapter 3, is about Islamic ethical perspective. In my conclusion, I outline my suggestions and recommendations. My main question is, what are the key ethical questions and challenges posed by modern technologies of genomic testing, especially within the context of a Muslim country like Qatar, and how can they be approached from Islamic perspective? So this is the big, fat question that I'm trying to answer the whole thesis. And in my chapter 1, to address the sub-question, what is genomics and what do we mean by genomic testing? What are the possible benefit and risk of this type of testing? And which of these benefit risks are certain, probable, and illusionary? So my main contribution in chapter 1, I give a comprehensive summary of genomic from a medical and scientific field. I try to present the information in a simple and informative way because, as I mentioned, my audience could be a religious scholar, could be policymaker. So I'm trying to present the information that they can understand and comprehend and make sense for them. And also I try to make it accurate and to the point because it's like an ocean. So you don't have to pick everything. You have to pick up what's relevant to your topic. And also I use credible and peer-reviewed up-to-date sources like PubMed database and some credible books and journals. So in my chapter 2, I try to address the sub-question, what are the key ethical challenges and dilemmas posed by the technologies of genomic testing worldwide, and more specifically in a Muslim country like Qatar? So these are the most important sources that I visited, and I found the Encyclopedia of the Human Genome is very useful because they have a chapter dedicated only for ethics. Anything in genetics, in genetic screening, variants, and all the technologies is very useful, I found it. So in chapter 2, upon my readings on ethical dilemmas in genomic testing, I realized that they revolved around 4 practical ethical questions. The first one is to test or not to test. Should we carry out doing genomic testing in the first place? Should we really do this testing? And the second one is to tell or not to tell. After we get the genetic result, should we tell the tested person about the genetic findings? Is it really necessary to tell him about the findings? The third one, to procreate or not to procreate. So if we know that the detected gene mutation may affect the offspring, should this affect the people's decision regarding marriage and family planning? And the fourth one is to modify or not to modify. So do we have to really genetically modify the genes? I don't know if you hear about the news about the Chinese scientist. He's sentenced to jail for 3 years because he genetically modified some babies. And according to him, he got everything approved by the IRB and ethical committee. But I'm sure that there's something under the table that he did. For that reason, he's sentenced to jail for 3 years. You know, all these ethical dilemmas around genomic testing. But in my thesis, I only focus on the first two questions because the remaining two questions, they fall beyond the scope of my thesis, and I'm trying to be as concise as possible so not to tackle a lot of things. So my main contribution in chapter 2. This chapter touched upon real-life examples represented by actual case studies. One of them was part of my personal experience during my research work at White Cornell Medicine. I work in White Cornell as a clinical research coordinator, and we see families and patients for our research work in genetics. So the case study one is about the family that I consented. So it's about incidental findings. I don't know if Dr. Ghali mentioned this one yesterday in your bioethics course, but what the meaning of incidental findings is meaning that the results that arise outside the original purpose for which the test or procedure was conducted. And the case study 2, management of late onset disease, the meaning that the disease that manifests in late stage of life, and I give example of Huntington disease. And also I bring the example of the scientist Nancy Wexler, the founder of the Huntington gene, because her story is very interesting. So I also mentioned this one in my thesis. So in chapter 3, I try to address the sub-question, how can these ethical challenges and dilemmas be addressed from the Islamic ethical perspective? So if we say genomics, okay, ethics, Islam, for sure you have to consult the book of Dr. Ghali, the new addition to his publication, Islamic Ethics and the Genome Question. And also another book, Islamic Perspective on the Principle of Biomedical Ethics, and also another book of Dr. Sajidina. I found it also very useful for my thesis. And there is also a book for Dr. Albar and Shamsi Basha, Contemporary Bioethics. Okay. Upon serving the Islamic discussion held in the symposium, Collective Ijtihad, scholarly publication, we found that most of them covered important topics like cloning and stem cell research, gene editing, DNA fingerprinting, and genetic counseling. However, they hardly addressed other equally important issues like incidental findings, like management of late onset disease, the possibility of sharing the genetic result with relatives. So obviously there is a lacuna here in the Islamic literature that we have a gap and we have to fill in the gap. So my main contribution in chapter 3, I give an overview of the field of Islamic bioethics in general and Islamic bioethics in genomics in particular, along with its historical background and mechanism of collective ijtihad. And also, I try to give a good summary of the main approaches that are used within Islamic bioethics. I didn't only focus on fiqh approach, because if you only focus on fiqh approach, you will end up having nothing, actually. You're not going to find your answers to your questions. So I consider fiqh, maqasid sharia, al-fiqh magazine, and al-ahkam al-khamsa for sure. And also, I consulted the theology. I visit theology, philosophy, and also Quran exegesis. And I give my personal judgment of the case studies that were presented in chapter 2. Based on Islamic approaches. And one of the impression, after comparing Western bioethic with the Islamic one, which I found very interesting, they share a lot of common ground between the two, but they mainly differ in handling the misattributed paternity. In Western bioethics, they show some flexibility that, and even they say that it's a right of the father to know who's his biological kids. But in Islamic bioethics, they have no tolerance whatsoever, because they care about the structure of the nuclear family, and they want to keep this structure as intact as possible. They don't want to provoke any things around the family, the well-established nuclear family. So in my suggestion and recommendation, I suggest to carry on the practice of collective ijtihad, where these scholar, the scientists and the religious scholar, they meet together and they discuss about the contemporary issue. So to keep continuing doing this one, because it's really very useful, especially for the something complex as genomics, And also, I advise a religious scholar to be informed about Western bioethical issue due to its richness and that could benefit us. Some topics are not well studied, like incidental findings that I mentioned, incidental findings and management of late onset disease. So this one should receive more attention from religious scholar. And also the field of Islamic bioethics in genomics should be continuously supported in Qatar. This is also one of my recommendation and suggestion. I ended up with a quote of Imam Shafi'i. I like it very much. He says, "Do not live in a place where there is no physician or jurist available." So I took this quote, I amended a little bit with the era of genomics, so I put it in this way. Do not live in a place where there is no physician, jurist, or bioethicist. So he can simplify the language of the jargon language that maybe scientists they use in their talk, and also to simplify the language of the jurists, because sometimes they have their jargon Islamic language. So in between, to work in between and to simplify everything. So as I said, I graduated last year, and this is the picture. It was taken in May 2019. Dr. Mataz, he was my intern examiner. This is my thesis. This is my email. It's available in Brickwest, but I don't think it's the full version. So if anyone is interested in having my thesis, drop me an email. I'll be very happy to share it with you as a PDF version. Thank you, and that's all I have.
My name is Mariam, and I don't have a PowerPoint because I suck at making them, and they make me nervous. So, and I'm not as organized as the bioethics people. So I wrote I also graduated a year and a half ago, I think. So I also forgot my thesis, but anyway. My topic was justice in classical Islamic thought, the perspectives of Al-Mawardi, Miskawi, and Ibn Taymiyyah. And just so you know, I come from an English literature background. I did my BA in English literature and international affairs. So before starting this program, I did not even know these people. Like, I did not even know who Al-Mawardi is or who Miskawi is. I only knew Ibn Taymiyyah, and like most of the information I knew about him were wrong. So, and for that, I'm very grateful to the program because. And I'm very happy with my thesis, not because it's good, but because I always find it the culmination of my learning experience here. When I first started, I didn't even recognize the names that were said in class of the scholars. And when the professors were joking about some scholars, and everyone was laughing, and I always felt like I'm an outsider. I didn't know, I didn't know, am I supposed to laugh? Who are these people? So I would just go with the flow. So yeah, I'm an Egyptian, so I think this explains why I'm interested in politics. So I wanted to write about freedom or justice or something along those lines. But then I'm not interested in what's currently happening. I'm more interested in theories and abstract ideas. So at first I started looking into freedom in classical sources, but then I realized that it's not feasible for a master's thesis, so I moved on to justice. And I focused on 3 dimensions: the epistemological framework of the 3 scholars, their definition of justice, and then I wanted to have a practical dimension, but I had to narrow it down, so I just chose their discourse on obedience to rulers. And the reason I chose to focus on the epistemological framework is that when I looked into the previous studies, I found out that most of the literature available on justice in classical Islamic thought are usually focusing on just one dimension, like either justice in general terms or justice as justice from a fiqhi legal perspective. And I felt that if we really want to grasp the what justice meant in the classical times, we need to look at the epistemological framework of these scholars, because ideas don't just appear in vacuum, they don't just come into existence. And when the three scholars that I chose have three different epistemological frameworks. Al-Mawardi is a jurist, but he's also a philosopher. So his framework is a combination of Greek, Persian, and the Islamic tradition. He puts a great emphasis on reason, and he actually, it's not very clear whether he gives primacy to reason over revelation or revelation over reason, but he does say that reason is a light with which you can distinguish between the good and the bad. But he also stresses that revelation is important, especially when it comes to justice, because people tend to be greedy sometimes, and revelation is important to ensure stability and that justice is being implemented. As for Miskawayh, his epistemological framework is Greek, is mostly Greek. Like, I think we can categorize his framework as just Greek. He sees reason as jawhar, substance. He sees it as eternal, and therefore all the judgments that the reason makes is eternal as well. For Ibn Taymiyyah, his framework is based on Quran and Sunnah. So his emphasis is on revelation, but he does not neglect reason. He acknowledges the importance of reason, but he says that the revelation is more important than reason. And while the other two say that reason and revelation cannot come into conflict and they cannot contradict each other, Ibn Taymiyyah says that they can contradict each other, and when this happens, the primacy goes to revelation. But he justifies his argument within a rational framework. So his argument is that if you rationally choose to become Muslim and you accept revelation, you cannot then say that revelation contradicts reason because you have rationally accepted the revelation. And then I'll move on to justice. So the way they understood the relationship between reason and revelation has influenced their definitions of justice. So I'll just give a quick summary, and if you want more details, I can give you later. Al-Mawardi and Miskawayh, they define justice in Greek terms. They say that it's the mean between two extremes, and it's a balance. And that you need to restore that balance. But Ibn Taymiyyah differs with them. He defines justice as putting everything in its own place. And he rejects the idea that justice is balance, and he accepts that we in Islam we have the notion of balance, but he says it's different from the Greek definition of balance. So in Greek philosophy, balance is the mean between two extremes, but in Islam, balance is the ability to weigh things and to be able to know the harmful and the beneficial, al-manfa'a wal-mafsada. And can you just give me a second? So yeah, so I think that's all. One last point. I found it very interesting that all three scholars have a hierarchical mode of thinking. Like, they accept the idea of hierarchy, but it's different. Like for Miskawayh, he sees the justice is distributive justice, so it's justice among people who belong to the same rank or the same social stratum. For Al-Mawardi, he sees the hierarchy as the ruling class and the people. So he says that rulers have innate virtues and the people have acquired virtues, and it's because rulers have a noble lineage. For Ibn Taymiyyah, the hierarchy is between Muslims and non-Muslims. So he endorses equality, but only among Muslims. I have to read more into that, but I found it interesting because he talks a lot about equality, but when it comes to Muslims and non-Muslims, it's a bit tricky. So this was my first chapter, and then for the second chapter, it was about obedience to rulers. So all three scholars say that obeying rulers is obligatory, and that injustice is not a sufficient reason to rise up against a ruler, but they do have a reasoning behind this. It's not just that we should accept injustice. It's because they see that rulers need to have certain, they need to possess certain virtues, and they need to implement justice. So like they situate their ideas within an ethico-religious framework. For me, I found that even though they do say that the relationship between the ruler and the people is a contractual relationship, and it's based on rights and duties on both ends, but they stress more the duties of the people towards the ruler than the rights that the people need to have. And even though they do accept that sometimes people will rise up and they will rebel against the ruler, they don't provide a mechanism. Ibn Taymiyyah, he completely rejects the idea of rebellion. Al-Mawardi and Meskawi, they do accept that there might be a rebellion, and they talk about al-hakim al-mutaghallib, usurper, that sometimes another person will try to usurp the power, and he will succeed in this. And they say that if he implements justice, then people need to obey the new ruler. But my problem with that was that they don't provide a mechanism. And I also think that the way they talk about obedience to rulers is probably a product of their time. There were political turbulences, and there were wars, and it was very important to preserve the society and to make sure that there is some sort of stability. So yeah, and I talk more about it in the thesis. Thank you.
Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum everyone. My name is Bilal Abdul Sattar. I'm second year master's student of College of Islamic Studies, Islamic Thought and Applied Ethics program. Two of my previous presenters has presented their master thesis, but I would be presenting my master thesis proposal, which I defended last month. So since it is an ongoing research and not fully developed, I would love to have your thoughts and comments on the research. So on the first day, while Dr. Mukhtar was discussing Sufi ethics, he slightly touched upon the notion of, the hadith, takhallaqu bi akhlaqillah, which is assuming the divine character traits. So my research revolves around this very notion, at-takhalluq bi akhlaqillah, and how it can be introduced to the modern discourse on virtue ethics. So to have a slight background, we all know that there are three dominant approaches in normative ethics, which are deontology, consequentialism, and virtue ethics. While both deontology and consequentialism are busy with the question what kind of action should one perform, virtue ethics is busy with the question what kind of person should one be. So like from this we can understand that both deontology and consequentialism are action-centered, and virtue ethics is agent-centered. When we look into the history, we can find that virtue played a dominant role while discussing ethical theories until the Enlightenment period. Later, the attention shifted from the agent to action, pushing the role of virtue in the ethical theories, virtue in the ethical discussion to the backseat. It was only with the famous article by Elizabeth Ann Scobb in 1950, which is Modern Moral Philosophy, and with the later works by Bernard Williams, McIntyre, and others, the revival of interest in virtue ethics can be seen. Growing interest in virtue ethics can be noticed when fields outside philosophy like education, cognitive science, and medical ethics also started discussing virtue ethics. In spite of this, secularization process has succeeded to a large extent to keep it isolated from engaging with religious, spiritual dimension, or to secularize virtues present in the religious discourse. However, a quick perusal of rich tradition of different religions shows that they too have contributions to make in this regard. So moving on to Sufism, which is a practice in Islam which focuses more on spiritual development and acquisition of good character traits, it too has so much to offer in this regard. For example, Abul Qasim al-Junaid defines Sufism as the acquisition of virtues and erasure of vices. Kushairi, for example, quotes Abu Bakr al-Qahtani as defining tasawwuf to be good character, and those who exceed others in good character exceeds them in tasawwuf. Thus, one realizes here that Sufism strives in realizing perfection in character along with constant awareness of the divine presence. One of the repeated ideas within the Sufi literature is the idea of takhalluq bi akhlaqillah, which is assuming the character traits of the Allah. Al-Ghazali mentions in Ihya Ulumuddin that the praiseworthy is everything that can be attributed to Allah, and those that cannot be attributed to Him is not perfection in itself. For Sufis, the meaning of being a perfect human lies in attaining the perfection of the divine names and attributes, where one learns and strives to realize particular perfection associated with each and every divine name. Sufis believe that divine names and attributes are in fact virtues which each individual must try to emulate. And with the assumption of those virtues, human beings realize their full potential. Moving to modern discussion on virtue ethics, McIntyre explains virtue to be an acquired human quality, the possession and exercise of which tends to enable us to achieve those goods which are internal to practices, and lack of which effectively prevents us from achieving any such good. Understanding the importance of virtues, McIntyre mentions how enjoining them helps in realization of full potential and true nature of human beings. Despite the secular framework in which centrality of virtue was revived, one notices the similarity between the Sufi approach and the modern approach on the emphasis given to the agent's acquisition of various virtues and how they lead to the realization of her full potential and true nature. However, while in Sufi approach, as mentioned by Al-Ghazali earlier, the source of those virtues are in divine names. So here comes the epistemological difference. In the modern approach, as viewed by McIntyre, the virtues should be understood using practical reasoning, must be grounded in specific place and time, and should also be generated considering the community wherein those virtues are to be put into practice. Recognizing the similarities and differences in both the approaches, this research aims to examine both the approaches, strives to compare and create conversation between them, and finally tries to seek potential contribution that could be made to the ongoing modern discussion on virtue ethics. In order to restrict the scope, this research will be examining the works of famous Sufi theologian and jurist Abu Hamid al-Ghazali to understand the concept of at-takhalluq bi akhlaqillah, and would be analyzing the works of contemporary modern philosopher McIntyre in order to situate the concept. Now, the reason for choosing these two figures are, both of them are considered to be the most influential figures in their respective field and have written independent works pertaining to the topic of discussion. Al-Ghazali has dedicated his work Al-Maqsid al-Asna fi Sharhi Asma'illah al-Husna entirely in discussing how one could assume divine character traits, and McIntyre has dedicated his work After Virtue fully in analyzing the virtue ethics. And like in both of their works, like for example, the centrality of virtue can be seen. And both of them adopted Aristotelian frameworks in their work with their own modifications. Now, going into the literature review, when we review the literature present in English language pertinent to the topic, the following were observed. Works related to a comparative analysis of Islamic virtue ethics in general and Sufi virtue ethics in particular with Western virtue ethics are rare. The concept of at-takhalluq bi akhlaqillah is not introduced in the modern discussion on virtue ethics. Also, conceptual analysis of Al-Ghazali's notion of at-takhalluq bi akhlaqillah is not present in the literature, and his work Al-Maqsad al-Asna fi Sharhi Asma'il al-Husna is rarely referred to in the works that studied Al-Ghazali's ethics and virtues. Finally, a comparative analysis between the thoughts of Al-Ghazali and McIntyre is not present either. I assume that the present research, by conceptually analyzing Al-Ghazali's notion of at-takhalluq bi akhlaqillah, and then by trying to introduce it in the modern discourse on virtue ethics through the works of McIntyre, will able to contribute to the aforementioned areas. So my literature review is divided into 3 sections. The first section reviews the genre of virtue ethics in general. The second section reviews the works on divine names and attributes. The third section reviews the works of Al-Ghazali and McIntyre. So, analyzing the literatures present in the genre of virtue ethics, we can find that a strong interest in bringing back the centrality of virtue ethics to the contemporary discussion on ethical theories can be noticed. Initial works which actually voiced and worked towards this interest were in fact comfortable working within the secular framework. Nevertheless, understanding the importance of virtue ethics and increasing interest in the engagement of virtue ethics from a religious perspective later on can be noticed. Like we can see Jewish perspective, Christian perspective, Hindu perspective, and Buddhist perspective here. And moving on to the Islamic virtue ethics, it has been noticed that the work engaging with the contemporary discussion on virtue ethical theories are rare. Now, just focusing on Islamic virtue ethics, we can see that there are mainly 4 trends that can be seen. The first one is approaching virtue ethics in comparison with other tradition, like for example Western tradition. And the second one is analyzing different virtues present in Islam. It is like analyzing only the particular virtues present in Islam. For example, Atif Khalil has discussed the virtue Rida in this article. And then examining virtues presented by different personalities, like for example the virtues discussed by Miska Wahi, for example. And then like the final trend which I noticed is like applied Islamic virtue ethics, and this is done in the context of medical. And then moving on to the second session, analyzing the literature present on the divine names and attributes. It is undertaken mainly from 3 dimensions. The first one is linguistic analysis of divine names and attribute, which involves in understanding wide array of meanings in each divine names and attributes in the light of Quran, Hadith, poems, lexicographic and literary sources. The second dimension from which it is engaged is doctrinal and theological analysis, where each divine name and attributes is analyzed through theological lens. The third dimension from which divine names and attributes is analyzed is through the ethical analysis, which actually analyzes the divine names and attributes in order to recognize them as models for humans to be emulated. So this dimension is my core focus for this research. So even in that, we can find that like when we consider primary sources that are available in English language, we can find that Ghazali's Maqsad al-Asna fi Sharhi Asma'il al-Husna is translated, and then Yusuf Keswit has translated Ibn Barrajan's few works into English. So these 2 works, like I have found these 2 works which are engaging with divine names and attribute from the ethical dimension. And then we can find secondary works like by William Chittick, Shehzad, and Sadia Sheikh. So when we analyze this work, we can notice that there are more works engaging the topic from the first 2 dimensions. However, works engaging from the third dimension, which is ethical analysis, is like comparative rare when we are comparing with the previous 2 dimensions. And then we can also find that lack of conceptual analysis of the notion of takhalluq bi akhlaqillah by comparing and understanding it from views of different classical Sufi present in the literature. So even though different Sufi scholars have discuss this concept of takhalluq bi akhlaqillah, they have different views on this concept, but a thorough analysis of like different Sufi scholars on this particular concept is not present in English literature. And also lack of conceptual analysis of Al-Ghazali's notion of the same is also found when I reviewed the literature. Then we can like also notice that few studies present on the ethics of divine names and attributes have dealt the subject by limiting to the understanding of Ibn al-Arabi alone and did not give required attention to other classical Sufis. Like for example, when we notice this 3 secondary references which sources which I produced here, like all the 3 of them were like while they were discussing ethics of divine names and attributes, they were focusing only on Ibn al-Arabi. They did not focus on like other scholars. So the third section is like I reviewed the literature present on Al-Ghazali and McIntyre. So what I notice is that comparative study between both the figure is absent, even though literatures engaging these figures from different dimensions individually are profusely present. Furthermore, Al-Ghazali's work Al-Maqsad al-Asna fi Sharh Asma'il al-Husna is rarely referred to in the works that studied Al-Ghazali's ethics and virtues. Even though we can find like many works discussing Al-Ghazali's ethics and virtues, we can also notice that this work is rarely referred to when they are discussing Al-Ghazali's ethics and virtues. So, but then when we review, we can notice that when we review the literature on Al-Ghazali, we can notice that Al-Ghazali is presented as a Sufi, as a jurist, as a theologian, as a philosopher, as a critic of philosophy, and finally as an Islamic reformer. And then we can also notice, like I said, secondary works focusing on Al-Ghazali's ethics and virtues by Sharif, Qasim, Abdullah, and Majid Fakhri. Now moving on to literatures on McIntyre, he has been approached from different dimensions, like his concepts has been analyzed, his approaches has been analyzed, even like theology has been developed from his work, his thoughts have been compared with other figures, and finally his thoughts have been applied in different fields. Now, having a background and having understood like what is present in the literature, like my thesis would be focusing on this particular research question. The main research question is how can at-takhalluq bi akhlaqillah, which is assuming the divine character trait, be introduced in the modern discourse on virtue ethics. Now there are three sub-questions. The first sub-question is what does at-takhalluq bi akhlaqillah mean, and what is the link between at-takhalluq and virtue ethics? The second question is like how can we interpret this turn to virtue ethics in modern times, and how can modern discourse on virtue ethics give space for Sufism to play a role through the concept of tradition? The third question is what is the potential contribution that Sufism can achieve within virtue ethics? So this is my methodology. My thesis will contain an introduction, 3 main chapters, and a conclusion. The initial chapter will be dedicated for a conceptual analysis of the notion of takhalluq bi akhlaqillah by exploring the works of Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, primarily by examining his 2 main works, Al-Maqsad al-Asna fi Sharh Asma'il al-Husna and Ihya Ulumuddin, along with other primary and secondary works. This will be followed by analyzing the relationship between at-takhalluq and virtue ethics. The second chapter will begin by analyzing the factors that led to the revivification of the virtue in the modern discussion on ethical theories. Later, a thorough analysis of McIntyre works, after virtue, a study in moral theory, whose justice, which rationality, and dependent rational animal, along with his other works, will be undertaken to understand his notion of virtue ethics. This will be followed by a critique on his understanding of virtue ethics, initially presenting the critiques presented by other scholars, followed by my own critique. With these 2 chapters, the foundation is set, and the third chapter will try to have a conversation between both the notions by comparing between them. This is later followed by presenting the potential benefit involved with its introduction, which is takhalluqu bi akhlaqillah's introduction in modern times. In the end, the concluding remarks of the overall analysis of the subject at hand is presented. So this is the outline of the chapter. The first chapter will be discussing towards understanding at-takhalluq bi akhlaqillah, definition of that, Al-Ghazali's notion of at-takhalluq bi akhlaqillah, and the relationship between at-takhalluq and virtue ethics. The second would be modern virtue ethics, the revival of virtue ethics in modern philosophical discourses, McIntyre's notion of virtue ethics, critiques on McIntyre's notion of virtue ethics. The third chapter would be at-takhalluq bi akhlaqillah and virtue ethics, dialogue between the notion and implication. With that, that's it from my side. Thank you so much.